Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. If you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to talk about the Supreme Court because it has issued a ruling today. And if you have some comments about it, pro or con, love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. If you haven't had a chance to hear, let me go through some of the basics. Supreme Court ruled today in a very narrow decision. I'll explain what that means in just a minute. But ruled 7-2 that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission's handling of the claims against Jack Phillips, who is, of course, the owner of Masterpiece Cakes in Colorado, showed hostility towards religion, and so doing, the commission violated his religious rights under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. It's a narrow ruling in that all it really did was address the actions of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, but did establish a general principle that indeed whenever there seems to be a conflict between an individual, especially those from the LGBT community, and religious rights, that those should be resolved in terms of tolerance. And I'll actually give you some of the quotes in just a minute. But it really doesn't set forth the circumstances or the principles in which you could seek exemptions from some of the so-called anti-discrimination laws or public housing laws. And this is sort of, if you've been listening to Point of View for some time, what Kelly Shackelford of First Liberty was predicting, and that is that the court, in the questions it was asking, really was looking for an out. If you look at it, the Supreme Court time and time again tries to decide not to decide. It does, of course, make major decisions, and decisions on everything from abortion to same-sex marriage have certainly come down. But whenever possible, the Supreme Court tries to narrowly define the issue, and in this particular case did, so that you ended up with a 7-2 decision. It might have been a 4-5 decision or 5-4 decision otherwise, but you had at least two of the liberals on the court, Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan, join with the 5 conservative justices, and you had the decision written actually by Anthony Kennedy, who in many cases has actually been a proponent of so-called same-sex marriage and gay rights and the rest, whether it's the Romer decision, the Obergefell decision, or some of those others. So it's a narrow decision in that regard, and frankly, I think opens up the possibility that a future case could be decided, and that case might be the one from our friends at First Liberty, which is the one out of Oregon. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But let me just give you a couple of the comments from the decision itself. Justice Kennedy said the commission's hostility was inconsistent with the First Amendment's guarantee that our laws be applied in a manner that is neutral towards religion. He also said the outcome of cases like this in other circumstances must await further elaboration in the courts. This is known as kicking the can down the judicial road for a while. All in the context of recognizing that these disputes must be resolved with tolerance, without undue disrespect to sincere religious beliefs, and without subjecting gay persons to indignities when they seek goods and services in an open market. Again, we have a number of states that have these so-called anti-discrimination laws, and others that have attempted to use the public accommodation laws to force individuals, and that would be Aaron and Melissa Klein in Oregon and their bakery, or it would be Jack Phillips in his bakery in Colorado. It could be, for example, a number of florists that we've looked at, photographers, a florist in Washington, a photographer in New Mexico, innkeepers in a variety of states, Vermont, New York, and other places, which are told that they are not able and not allowed to refuse service. So this is sort of a narrow religious ruling. It's positive for Jack Phillips in the sense that he is not going to be hounded, I would think, anytime soon by the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, but he still may be driven out of business if you're not familiar with his circumstances, because as soon as these two individuals, Charlie Craig and David Mullins, were refused service, and I'm going to come back to the fact, this conversation, I looked it up, this conversation, I don't think it was 20 seconds long. The whole encounter, he said, may have been all of 30 seconds. As a matter of fact, he gives almost a point by point of what they said, what he said, because, first of all, he had to recount it the next day because the mother of one of the homosexual men called up and said, what was that all about? And so he had about a 5-minute conversation with her explaining what he said and what they said. But the exchange was, no, I don't do it. They flipped him. Well, one of them just walked out. The other one swore at him, flipped him off, and that was sort of it. You know, it's amazing how a 20-second conversation can change your life forever. Well, of course, what they did is they went out and got every one of their friends to vilify him and to call him and to then, of course, as we've talked about, get the Colorado Civil Rights Commission to fine him. And as a result, I've seen estimates that he probably lost over these many years now almost $100,000 worth of business. But, you know, we'll see whether or not just the constant drumbeat against him in Colorado will drive him out of business anyway. But at least he theoretically is protected from the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. But again, the issue that Judge Kennedy said is the reason and the motive for the baker's refusal was based on his sincere religious beliefs and convictions. The court's precedents make it clear that the baker, in his capacity as the owner of a business serving the public, might have his right to the free exercise of religion limited by general applicable laws. So Kennedy, was still acknowledging the possibility that you could use some of these public accommodation laws against individuals that would have a religious conviction, but then goes on instead, still the delicate question of when the free exercise of religion must yield to an otherwise valid exercise of state power needed to be determined in an adjudication in which religious hostility on the part of the state itself would not be a factor in the balance the state sought. In other words, reading between the lines, if the Colorado Civil Rights Commission hadn't made so many strident comments, hadn't been such bullies, maybe we would decide this case, but because you've given us an easy out, and that is you have greatly overstepped your bounds of propriety and your legal responsibility, we can just simply deal with you and not even have to deal with the bigger issue of when does religious liberty give right to LGBT concerns. And a little bit later in this article that we've posted, it says, by wading into the culture wars, the justices had to confront recent decisions on both gay rights and religious liberty. In 2015, of course, we have the same-sex marriage decision. In 2014, of course, we have the question of Hobby Lobby about the owner's faith by being able to refuse to provide abortifacient contraceptives to its workers. So we'll see where that goes, but nevertheless, we'll take a break, and when we come back, I want to put this in a different context. The problem with this is almost every time we talk about sex or sexual orientation, we don't see the clear principle because it's so motivated by, are we giving the LGBT community their rights or are we taking them away? So I want to take that out of this and look at some of the other cakes that Jack Phillips refused to bake and see if that might help you understand why this is an issue even broader than the issue of religious liberty. We'll take a break and come back. Also, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The debate about shooting incidents in America can be divided into at least two categories. What can be done to prevent a shooting? What can we do to stop a shooting that is taking place? Gun control advocates focus most of their attention on the first issue, but Glenn Kessler, doing a fact check in the Washington Post, explained that most gun restrictions wouldn't prevent mass shootings. A recent example was the shooter in Santa Fe, Texas, who had a shotgun and a revolver, but no gun that would be restricted under the current proposed legislation. Is there anything we can do to stop a shooter once he decides to use a weapon? The FBI report on active shooter incidents in the United States provides some possible answers. Looking at the data, it is easy to conclude that the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is to have a good guy with a gun. The good guy could either be law enforcement or an armed citizen. But there are many people who reject the idea that the way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. They say it is a nice-sounding slogan, but it is rarely true. That is where the FBI report provides some perspective. It looks at all active shooter events, not just completed mass shootings that are ones reported by the media. The report shows that active shooting incidents are indeed on the rise, but it also documents that armed citizens can make a difference. David French, looking at the FBI report, says, as more Americans obtain carry permits, more Americans will be on scene and able to react. Moreover, what's missing from the data is any indication that armed citizens make the crisis worse. The stereotype of carry permit holders spraying panic gunfire is simply wrong. This report shows what armed citizens can do to make us safer. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you're just joining us, talking about the Supreme Court decision rendered today in favor of Jack Phillips, 7-2, saying that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, in the handling of their claims against him, actually violated his religious rights. I'd like to, if I can, for just a minute, and we'll move on to some other topics, unless, of course, you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, to take it out of the issue of sexual orientation. Part of the problem is that sometimes when we talk about sex, whatever it might be, whether it's the issue of abortion, whether it's contraception, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's sex education, sometimes the mind just kind of covers over, and especially when we're talking about LGBT issues, people think about civil rights. So I thought for a minute, just so that you can understand that this is a case that focuses on religious liberty, but it really gets down to your freedom as an individual and really your First Amendment free speech freedom. If you think about it, whether you're baking a cake, whether you're taking a picture, whether you're painting a picture, there is a sense in which you're using creativity. When you're writing a book or an article, as I do, you don't expect other people to tell you how to write it. I mean, you might solicit advice, and that's the case, but you don't expect that indeed somebody comes in. And, of course, even when you talk about writing, if somebody came in and said, look, I know that you're a writer and you do freelance, and I want you to write a book, and as I'm listening to the book being described, I'm going, first of all, I'm not a ghostwriter, but even if I was, I disagree with the premise of the book. On the other side of the glass, I've got an actor, and there are sometimes you say, okay, am I going to act in that particular play because that may actually promote an idea that I don't agree with? And I grew up around this idea that you have the right to be civil disobedient, because my closest friend as I grew up from grade school all the way through high school was an individual who, though not religious at all, actually very secular, nevertheless was a conscientious objector. And so he wore a black armband and protested the Vietnam War. And of course, we talked the other day here on Tinker versus Des Moines back in the 1960s that gave the right of individuals to wear a black armband at school. And then when he actually worked in the video areas, he said, I will never do anything that would promote the defense industry. And so if there was ever a contract with someone who might even indirectly work with the Defense Department, he would not work on that. Now, of course, he didn't open the company, but I had no problem that if he had his own company, and if somebody came in, whether it's the National Rifle Association, whether it's Defense Department, whether it was Air Force recruiters, whether it's somebody that works in the Marines, whatever it might be, for him to say, look, I just don't do that, and say, yes, and that's his right to say he should not be forced to take on something he would disagree with. It is interesting to look at this decision as it came down. I mentioned Anthony Kennedy wrote the majority decision. Then you had some concurring decisions with Justice Gorsuch and Alito. You also had concurring decisions with Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan. Since they're liberals, they wanted to maybe modify a fairly significant part of, even though they agreed with the overall decision, they came to it differently. But there were two dissenters, and one of those was Sonia Sotomayor, and the other one was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her piece, said, I see no reason why the comments of one or two commissioners should be taken to overcome Phillips' refusal to sell a wedding cake to Craig and Mullins. In other words, you're using a silly excuse. He should be forced to actually bake a cake, even if he disagrees with that. And so that's why I can see that because the LGBT issue is foremost, then you can see that she says he should be compelled to do so even if he disagrees. That's why I want to take it out of the LGBT issue for just a minute. If you've ever seen any interviews with Jack Phillips, you see that this is not the first time he's declined to bake a cake. For example, he declined to design a cake that celebrated divorces. Matter of fact, apparently there have been more than a few that have come in and said, hey, I just want to celebrate my divorce. And he goes, well, I'm just not, I don't believe that you should be celebrating a divorce. And so, find another baker. He's also declined to design cakes for Halloween. He's declined apparently a couple of times to design cakes that would have adult themes on them. He's also declined to bake cakes that were anti-American. Let's just take the divorce issue as a good example. Divorce is legal in America, just as same-sex marriage is legal in America, and even more so because there are all sorts of laws that certainly allow for people to get divorced. And yet, I think if this were a case that was brought by a divorced couple or a divorcee all the way to the Supreme Court, I don't know. It would be interesting to see how Ruth Bader Ginsburg would rule in that case. Does a baker have a right to actually say, because I personally don't believe that divorce is something you should celebrate, he has the right to tell a couple or an individual that wants to celebrate a divorce, does he have the right to actually decline that? And I don't know, but I'm pretty sure you might not get a 9-0 decision, but you could get an 8-1 decision, maybe. I don't know where Sonia Sotomayor sits on that issue, because we recognize that, look, there are times when people are going to ask you to do something, and you may have some reservations about that. Now, this isn't denying an individual. As a matter of fact, in the conversation that Jack Phillips had with these two individuals, Charlie Craig and Dave Mullins, he remembers saying, and I assume that that's true because it's entered into a court record and nobody disputed it, that he said, look, I can give you cookies, cakes, all sorts of stuff, but I can't make you a same-sex wedding cake the way you want it. And that's when they, shouted at him, flipped him off, called him bad names, and then walked out of the store. But it is, I think, striking about the fact that he wasn't denying service to these individuals in any other context. It was just this one limited context. A good example is a case that I've also been following out of the state of Kentucky right now, where this T-shirt producer, he does Christian T-shirts, and like Jack Phillips, has declined to put together T-shirts that promote certain kinds of things. But people say, well, when he finally turned down this attempt to get him to actually promote a gay pride parade, then he balked at that. And he said, look, I'm not anti-homosexual. I have homosexuals that work in my print shop. I sell all sorts of things to homosexuals and produce T-shirts. As a matter of fact, recently I produced it for a band. The lead singer is a lesbian, but this has to do with whether or not I would promote that particular activity. And what was so interesting is that there were some lesbian T-shirt manufacturers and printers, I think it was in the state of New Jersey, if I remember right, who actually wrote and defended him as well, because they said, we don't want to travel down this road where we are then forced to promote ideas that we would disagree with. And so I think the court still, of course, has decided not to decide, but nevertheless, I think we will have to see how this is actually playing out in the future. And if you can see the divorce example as one, or Halloween as an example, or not actually producing a cake with an adult theme, then I think you can see why this is really not necessarily even a religious issue. It is, if you will, a free speech issue, and it's an issue of compelled speech. Can the government compel you to put together a message that you disagree with? And the answer should be easily, without even a moment's thought, no. And, of course, when you look at this decision, which it took almost 60 pages to write out, of course, that's the way the Supreme Court deals with these things, you really could come to it just in terms of what I think would be basic common sense. Nevertheless, just before we wind down this particular topic, I thought I'd read from the Alliance Defending Freedom Council. Kristen Wagner was on the program with us a while back, and as this decision came down, she reminded everybody that Jack serves all customers. He simply declines to express messages or celebrate events that violate his deeply held beliefs. And I think that was argued pretty well. She went on to say, creative professionals who serve all people should be free to create art consistent with their conviction without the threat of government punishment. And then she went on to say, government hostility towards people of faith has no place in our society, yet the state of Colorado was openly antagonistic towards Jack's religious beliefs about marriage. The court was right to condemn that. Tolerance and respect for good faith differences of opinion are essential in a society like ours. The decision makes clear that the government must respect Jack's beliefs about marriage. I think it's going to be a while before we get a real decision about how we balance religious liberty with LGBT issues, but at least this is a step towards rectifying the circumstances of Baker Jack Phillips. If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Otherwise, we're going to move on to some topics, including my commentary for today. We'll be back right after this.
With the way things are going right now, there's got to be a source of truth somewhere.
Eric lives in California, and he's listened to Point of View since he was a child hanging around his dad's auto shop in Nevada. He says it's his only trustworthy source of information about what's happening in the world.
Well, I feel bad because I have not been donating, and I'll tell you what, I'm getting back to that because just recently I realized with all the junk going on with all the media, with all these news things, the only one that I count on is you guys, and what would I do if you guys weren't there? I don't know what I'd do. Where would I get my news? And I would be dead in water. So I got to do my part.
Make sure you do your part, like Eric. Join the Truth Team. Get all the details by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team. Support the truth and make a difference for the future. 800-347-5151. and pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me give you a program note. In the next hour, we have Mark Hancock with us. He's with Trail Life. We're going to talk about the decision of the Boy Scouts to just simply become the Scouts. And we've posted a piece here on how the Boy Scouts kind of lost their way. And so we're going to chat with him about that. We'll talk a little bit about, of course, this decision coming down on the Supreme Court, but then get into it in more detail in the latter part of the next hour, in which Travis Weber, who is the director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council, to really get into the meaning of this case and where that goes. And then I might also mention that in the third hour, which is not heard on our local station here, but you can certainly listen online or go to Facebook Live, Chelsen Vicari will be with us. The new book, Distortion, How the New Christian Left is Twisting the Gospel and Damaging the Faith. So I've got a lot to cover, and we will certainly do that. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I thought for a minute I would go back to a couple of commentaries that I've done, one that came out on Friday, another one that came out today, just issues that you need to be aware of. And there are many times when I will cover an issue on Point of View and then do a commentary about it. Sometimes just the opposite happens. I'll do a commentary about it, and I think I probably need to mention that on Point of View. And one of those has to do with a phenomenon that I first wrote about 10 years ago. Sometimes you begin to say, didn't I write that a few years ago? And I look up and go, no, I wrote that in 2008. This is 2018. So 10 years ago, I wrote about the fact that at that time, we had now 2 states that had already passed what is called the National Popular Vote Compact. This is an attempt to really dismantle the Electoral College without passing a constitutional amendment. And a recent vote in Connecticut now has brought that number from 2 up to 11 states and the District of Columbia. And I thought it was kind of interesting because if you think about that, Connecticut is oftentimes known as the Constitution State, in large part because of Roger Sherman. I'll get to that in just a minute. But before I do, let me talk about what this National Vote Compact is. This is where states are now entering into a compact. Technically, it's voluntary, but since it's been passed through the legislature, I guess it has the force of law. And the compact is this. They agree to allocate their electors to the winner of the popular vote, regardless of how their citizens voted. So as more of these states do this, we are essentially, without even a national vote, just with local votes in various states from various representatives, moving away from an electoral college to a popular vote. Now, one of the reasons why most people aren't aware of this is because they haven't changed so far, because the compact only goes into effect when states holding 270 electoral votes have agreed to the plan. Why 270? Because you need 270 electoral votes to be elected president. So right now we're at 172 electors, states that met up there. So you're less than 100 away. It will only take 1 or 2 big states to push them over. And so the first issue is we are moving somewhat quickly. I mean, to go from 2 states 10 years ago to 11 states in the District of Columbia today, it is kind of interesting to see, okay, what would be the next state? Of course, if California did it, it would be instantaneous. Or if, of course, Texas did it, which it will not, or maybe Florida, which it will not. It would probably take some other states to do that. But anyway, it's kind of intriguing to see how that could play itself out pretty quickly. But Tara Ross, in a recent column that I talk about, reminds us of how the vote in Connecticut for the Electoral College is so ironic because one of the real founders of our country is a man by the name of Roger Sherman. Matter of fact, if you go to Constitution Hall, you go to where the Declaration of Independence was written and where the Constitution was written, but especially even the Declaration. The Declaration of Independence was, of course, drafted by Thomas Jefferson. Most people know that. But he was part of a committee that also involved who? Well, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Roger Sherman, to mention one other name. And so he was, in a sense, known as the kind of the key statesman, certainly for Connecticut, and in some respects is responsible with what was called the Great Compromise. Because he was a statesman and a founder from Connecticut, he recognized that the bigger states were going to overrule the smaller states. So the first great compromise was the idea of a bicameral legislature, where, yes, in the House of Representatives, the big states would have more representatives because that was based on population. But then in the Senate, that particular branch would be 2 senators for each state. So that gave Connecticut the equal amount of weight as Massachusetts, Virginia, of course, today, the equal weight to California, Texas, Ohio, New York, all sorts of places. So, nevertheless, that was the case. So, again, he wanted to prevent a situation in which the large states were always dominating the small states like Connecticut and Rhode Island. So, he was not only known for the Great Compromise, the reason we have a bicameral legislature, but also he opposed this idea of a popular vote for the presidency, because he knew that his small state and other small states would be outvoted. Matter of fact, one of his famous phrases was, he said he feared that the people, quote, will generally vote for some man in their own state, and the largest state will have the best chance for that appointment. Well, back then when you didn't have a lot of national broadcast and you didn't have national papers, that was the concern. But even today, you can recognize that if you come from a large state, and you can assume that your state will vote for you, whether it was Ronald Reagan running from California or a variety of other individuals going all the way back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt running from New York, you would recognize that that did in many ways give you a very significant advantage. So that's why he opposed this idea of a popular vote. And if you think about this, this is still an issue today. If you go to my commentary, and you can go to pointofview.net and click on viewpoints, and then there's a section where it says see other viewpoints, you will, if you scroll down, see a map that was actually posted, interestingly enough, by Karen, and it shows the United States in which California, Texas, Florida, and New York are sized according to their population. And you can see that very quickly those states just would smother all the rest of the states. And a good illustration of this is in the last election. Hillary Clinton received more than 65 million votes from just 2 states, New York and California. Now, if we had a direct popular vote, she would have merely focused her attention on New York, Los Angeles, and, Illinois in there, maybe Chicago, and nowhere else. And, of course, if we had a popular vote, I think the same thing. Donald Trump would have focused a lot more time and attention on New York. He pretty much conceded New York to Hillary Clinton, knowing that she would win this, since it is, again, a winner-take-all circumstance with the Electoral College. So a different set of ways of electing president would also create a different set of various campaigns. And as a result, Hillary Clinton not only would have spent her time and even more time in California and New York, do you think she'd ever have made her way to Ohio or Wisconsin or Michigan? Of course, she didn't go there anyway because she thought she was going to win, and Donald Trump went there and won instead. So if nothing else, I think Roger Sherman, even back in the 19th century, understood what would happen without an electoral college. And so as we see this continued series of votes taking place in these state legislatures for the National Popular Vote Compact, I think it's important to go back and learn our history, because the individuals that were at the Constitutional Convention and established the Electoral College wanted to create a system that would force various candidates to go into all the states, not just the voter-rich states. And back then, it was forcing them to pay attention to states like Connecticut and Rhode Island. Today, it again is forcing them to pay attention to states in the Midwest, states in the South, sometimes even states in the West. And, of course, it's been a long time since we've had any candidate that's gone to all 50 states. I think the last time somebody did that, if I remember right, was in the 1960 election. Richard Nixon pledged that he would go to all 50 states. And, again, as much as I love our friends in Alaska and Hawaii, that didn't really make a whole lot of sense in terms of election strategy. So already we have a situation in which candidates avoid certain states because they already concede them to the opponent, and so they're never really running a national campaign. an electoral college is the best we have right now to force them to run a national campaign. But this recent vote in Connecticut suggests that maybe soon we're moving to simply a popular vote. Let's take a break. If you'd like to read this commentary, it came out June 1st. It's on our website, pointofview.net.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Military chaplains have been leading prayer at military events for as long as this country has had a military. But one group wants the military to silence the prayers of chaplains. In February of 2017, a group sent a letter to commanders of the Air National Guard base in Peace, New Hampshire. The letter, signed by an attorney, had the look and feel of a legal demand letter, but while it tossed around legal lingo and cited a case or two, it stopped short of actually threatening a lawsuit. Nonetheless, their message was pretty clear. Prayer at official events violates the Constitution, is beyond the scope of a government entity, and is unnecessary and divisive, it said. Our friends at the Chaplain Alliance for Religious Liberty, a group of endorsers that speaks for about half of our armed forces chaplains, asked us to respond. Mike Berry, one of our attorneys and former Marine JAG officer, calmly explained that the Constitution, federal law, military regulations, and court precedent make it clear that not only may chaplains pray at official events, chaplains are protected when they do. The Air National Guard says the invocations will now continue. You should visit firstliberty.org and read the rest of First Liberty's letter. Military chaplains play an essential role and should never be censored or prohibited from providing invocations at official military events. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that in the next hour we're going to have Mark Hancock with us, Trail Life. Also come back a little bit to the Supreme Court decision briefly before we get to the interview with him, and then we'll get into it in more detail in the last half of the next hour with Travis Weber, who's the director of Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council. Let me just mention my commentary for today is Stopping Active Shooters. And there is some great material that has come out, interestingly enough, from of all places, the FBI. They have a report called Active Shooter Incidents in the United States, and it really provides, I think, some of the best documentation I've seen so far of the truthfulness of the phrase, to stop a bad guy with a gun, you need a good guy with a gun. Because a lot of people said, well, that's a nice sounding slogan, but it's rarely true. First of all, you'll see, no, it actually is one of the more significant reasons why, indeed, there have been the less opportunities for some of these active shooters to actually fulfill their devious plans. Because if you define an active shooter either as somebody in law enforcement or a citizen with a concealed carry, you can see that there are all sorts of examples in the active shooter incidents report. And more importantly, it also answers another question, because people say, okay, maybe sometimes that's the case, but at what risk? Because these individuals that have carry permits, they're going to be the ones that are going to be shooting everywhere, and so we might have more innocent bystanders killed. Again, if you look at the FBI report on active shooter incidents, you see that, as David French points about in his column, what's missing from the data is any indication that armed citizens make the crisis work. The stereotype of a carry permit holder spraying panic gunfire is simply wrong. So if you'd like to read that or pass it on to others that are just convinced that concealed carry is a bad idea and that it has no possible chance of stopping some of these active shooter incidents, you can see that the FBI report actually goes and does give some answers to that. Just before we take a break, though, we mentioned the other day that President Donald Trump, actually provided a pardon, a presidential pardon for Dinesh D'Souza. Now, I'll be honest, full disclosure here, I've never liked these pardons. You especially have had pardons that especially President Clinton gave to people that did not deserve them. Pardons sometimes give people their life back. You know, I can think of the pardon that was given to Chuck Colson, allowed him to vote and no longer be considered a felon. And, of course, you have Dinesh D'Souza now, that he will no longer be considered a felon and be allowed to vote and participate. But he does give a very significant behind-the-scenes look at some of this. And when I heard him speak this on television the other day, I thought I might share it with you. We only got a few minutes, so I'm going to summarize quite a bit. But first of all, why indeed was he prosecuted? In 2012, he says, I attempted to help my longtime college friend, Wendy Long, who was running as a Republican for the U.S. Senate in New York. So he said, I asked two of my associates to donate $10 apiece to her campaign. Then I reimbursed them. In so doing, I broke the law by exceeding the campaign finance limit, because the limit's $10,000. So he gave $10,000, but then he had two of his friends give $10,000 and then later reimbursed him. Now, it's interesting because if he hadn't bothered to reimburse them, or if he'd waited maybe even a few years and say, consider this a loan right now, I don't think they would have been able to catch him. But the bottom line is he already had a target on his back. Why? Because he had produced some of these films that were critical of the Obama administration, and of course later even critical of Hillary Clinton. And so one of the things that Dinesh D'Souza says in his piece is, now it's an open secret that campaign finance laws are regularly transgressed just about every election season, yet such cases are rarely prosecuted. In general, the government only goes after chronic or repeat offenders or those who break the law with corrupt intent, seeking to buy favors or attain some sort of quid pro quo. And he points out Rosie O'Donnell has admitted that at least on 5 separate occasions, she's exceeded campaign finance limits. Nobody's ever prosecuted her, and she'd be a repeat offender. So if you wanted to go after somebody, you go after Rosie O'Donnell. Well, they didn't go after her. They went after him for a one-time situation, which is somewhat convoluted, because if you look at this, it costs the government a lot to prosecute him. First of all, he didn't know all of this until he was able to get the files. The FBI file was eventually turned over to Congress, and it wasn't turned over for years because FBI Director James Comey, you remember that name? Okay, remember that name. It was FBI Director James Comey refused to provide that file on the pretext that, well, it might reveal confidential sources, contained information that would jeopardize the Bureau's work. I love what he says, and blah, 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 blah. Well, anyway, they relented and provided a redacted version, but that was enough to see that the agency spent $100,000 to investigate a case involving $10,000 to $10,000 political contributions. That itself, as he said, is odd enough. So then the argument that has been made more recently by the attorney that prosecuted Dinesh D'Souza is, well, this is amazing that Donald Trump would pardon him because, after all, Dinesh D'Souza actually pled guilty. So he's guilty, so what's the big issue? This is the part I'd not heard, and that is, as he was being prosecuted for the issue of campaign finance limits, they then said, if you'll plead guilty to this first violation, we won't bring this second violation against you. And he says, what was that? Well, the second violation was called filing a false document. Evidently, he said he did this inadvertently because I was the source of the contributions. And so this was a second violation. Well, it turns out that the first charge carries a maximum of 2 years in federal prison. The second charge carries up to 5. And so, in a sense, what he was doing is trying to force, that is, the prosecutor trying to force Dinesh D'Souza to plead guilty on the first case because he originally was going to plead not guilty. And so, again, Dinesh D'Souza says this is a standard tactic used by prosecutors. It is the single factor that explains why federal criminal cases have a conviction rate approaching 100%. It's important to realize the government is pressuring not only the guilty, but also the innocent to plead guilty. And, of course, the reaction to this is the fact that you can look at all sorts of notable individuals. I mentioned Rosie O'Donnell. You can mention Michael Moore. We can go through the list of individuals who have, in one way or another, admitted that they've exceeded the campaign finance limits, but none of them have ever been prosecuted, and none of them ever had to spend any time behind locked doors. Now, again, it's called a halfway house, but if you've seen the movie where Dinesh D'Souza takes you there, you realize it's not exactly the Holiday Inn, and it's around hardened criminals. And so, again, it was very obvious that he was targeted, and this is one of the reasons that Donald Trump said that you were mistreated. Donald Trump, in his flowery language, used some other words, but the FCC would not allow me to use those. You can read the article and see what apparently Donald Trump said, and Dinesh D'Souza has received a pardon. Again, I think these pardons have been terribly misused and overused, but nevertheless, Dinesh D'Souza, if indeed we're going to provide pardons, certainly he was a very worthwhile candidate, and that, if nothing else, is the rest of that story. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into everything from the Supreme Court decision today to decision by the Boy Scouts to simply become the Scouts. We'll talk about that. First with Mark Hancock, and then a little bit later on the Supreme Court decision with Travis Weber. And if you'd like to find some of the things we've been talking about today, all of it available on the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll cover some more topics right after these important messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to be spending some time today talking about a number of issues. Let me just mention real quickly, then we'll get back to it a little bit later this hour. The Supreme Court has just ruled today in a 7-2 decision that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission's handling of the claims brought by Jack Phillips, and he is the Christian baker of Masterpiece Bakery, actually showed hostility towards religion. In so doing, the commission violated his religious rights under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Later this hour, we're going to be talking with Travis Weber, who is the director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council. And I might just mention that the majority decision, interesting enough, was written by Anthony Kennedy. He said the commission's hostility was inconsistent with the First Amendment's guarantee that our laws be applied in a manner that is neutral towards religion. He also then held out for really dealing with this issue in a broader way in the future. This was a narrow decision, very much like Kelly Shackelford of First Liberty on this program suggested, that they really just looked at Colorado Civil Rights Commission and really refused at this point to decide the broader issue of what do you do when you have a conflict between an individual's religious liberty or First Amendment freedoms and the LGBT agenda. So they said, in this particular case, Anthony Kennedy said, the outcome of the cases like this in other circumstances must await further elaboration in the courts, all in the context of recognizing that these disputes must be resolved with tolerance, without undue disrespect to sincere religious beliefs, and without subjecting gay persons to indignities when they seek goods and services in an open market. We're going to get into that in a little more detail in the latter part of this hour. Travis Weber will be with us, but we have scheduled, and we'll continue with this conversation with Mark Hancock. He is, of course, with Trail Life USA, and we have talked with him before and wanted to get his comments. Let me just mention that we've posted one article in which he was interviewed, How the Boy Scouts Lost Their Way. And I might also talk about another one, which we won't get to right now, but is on our website, Why There's an Increased Interest in Homeschooling. Does seem to be an abandonment of some of these traditional institutions, individuals leaving the public schools because of what's happening there, individuals leaving the Boy Scouts because of what has been happening there as well. So, Mark Hancock, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. It's great to be here.
We have been talking with you for some time about Trail Life, and originally the conversation was, well, this the Boy Scouts, though it was at the very center of the American life in 1910, and it was something that was applauded by America, eventually it became one of the most vilified organizations in America. And so then the board decided to say, well, we're tired of taking the hit, so maybe we'll allow kids that have same-sex attraction here. Maybe we'll wonder even whether or not we could have homosexual scout leaders. This latest one, I think, caused a lot of people to say, okay, maybe it's time to leave, because the Boy Scouts, now they're just called the Scouts. Give us a little bit of a history there of what's happened in the Boy Scouts.
Well, it's clear that over the last 5 years, the Boy Scouts have kind of exhibited a willingness to abandon some of their historic and tested principles and traditions. When you leave your well-traveled path, the next thing to go is to courage to navigate with conviction in contrary times. And it's clear we're living in contrary times. And so it just seems that they've lost their way a little bit, that they've left their path, that beautiful path that gave us presidents and astronauts and senators and generals and civic leaders, that they somehow decided that was something that needed to be abandoned. And of course, about 5 years ago was when the idea of an organization like Trail Life that would pick up where the Boy Scouts dropped off and continue on that path with the traditional values and the Christ-centered focus was necessary. And so we've seen some tremendous growth over the last 4.5 years or so. We're in 49 states now with almost 27,000 members. We're operating out of about 750 troops across the country.
And again, we have information about Trail Life. We have a link to the Twitter feed, the Facebook page, the website, and all of the rest, including this article we've posted. And you mentioned these leaders. Many of them were Eagle Scouts. And it's funny, I was watching Mike Rowe the other day, and he was on with Tucker Carlson, and he's an Eagle Scout. Matter of fact, listed as a distinguished Eagle Scout, but he was lamenting the direction in which this has gone. I had a member of Congress in here recently, Pete Sessions. He was an Eagle Scout. Both of his sons were Eagle Scouts. I didn't press him on whether or not he wished his kids now had been in Trail Life, because they all got their Eagle Scout designation before you started. But this is, I think, a real concern, because it used to be if I would look down a resume and I'd see a young man was an Eagle Scout, I didn't really need to know anything else. I knew that this was a self-motivated individual that had been trained very well, had the tenacity to achieve the highest rank. And now, because of all the changes that the Boy Scouts of America have made, including now just be called Scouts, I think it sort of devalues that a little bit. And one of the things maybe you could talk to our listeners about is we have some of our listeners who their kids have been in the Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, but you've said that they could transfer over to Trail Life. Talk about that.
Well, it's a tremendous legacy that the Boy Scouts have laid, and you can't deny that. And in the interest of transparency, my oldest son is an Eagle Scout, but he transferred over to Trail Life USA and achieved our highest award, which is the Freedom Award. A little bit more difficult than the Eagle. It took him about 1.5 years after he transferred over to get that. But we actually had our board of directors annual meeting this weekend, and that's one of the things we talked about is what that means to recognize that award, which doesn't have a specifically Christian worldview anymore in Trail Life, and what the danger is in doing that. Because there are elements of our program that are specifically Christ-focused and are obviously missing from the Boy Scouts, particularly recently. So how long do we want to continue that recognition? And so we recognize that legacy, and there's a date certain. I can't tell you that date right now, but there's a date certain where at some point we won't recognize the Eagle Award earned after that certain date, because you're exactly right. For all the thousands and thousands of amazing men who earned that award in the past, received that award in the past, it doesn't lose any value at all. It's an amazing accomplishment. But we had to set a date that said, beyond this date, it's just not the same thing that it was. Right. And to give it that same thing and say that we would recognize that it's just different. But we do allow boys to transfer their skill-related badges from Boy Scouts over into Trail Life USA. Starting a fire and hiking and camping, some of those things, those are skills that are absent, the Christ-centered focus. And so we allow a lot of those to transfer into Trail Life. But some of our badges, like around the family man, around the values type badges.
Those would be different,
yeah, those are different. So we don't give credit for those because we have a specific Christian worldview that's written into ours.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Mark Hancock. He'll be with us a little bit longer, so if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, 1-800-351-1212. Later on this hour, we're going to be talking about the Supreme Court decision today having to do with religious liberty and Jack Phillips. So if you'd like to join us, I'd really like to get those calls in now. So if you'd like to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll also talk about the girls. They crave adventure and camping. What about that? We'll talk about that with Mark Hancock right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The debate about shooting incidents in America can be divided into at least two categories. What can be done to prevent a shooting? What can we do to stop a shooting that is taking place? Gun control advocates focus most of their attention on the first issue, but Glenn Kessler, doing a fact check in the Washington Post, explained that most gun restrictions wouldn't prevent mass shootings. A recent example was the shooter in Santa Fe, Texas, who had a shotgun and a revolver, but no gun that would be restricted under the current proposed legislation. Is there anything we can do to stop a shooter once he decides to use a weapon? The FBI report on active shooter incidents in the United States provides some possible answers. Looking at the data, it is easy to conclude that the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is to have a good guy with a gun. The good guy could either be law enforcement or an armed citizen. But there are many people who reject the idea that the way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. They say it is a nice-sounding slogan, but it is rarely true. That is where the FBI report provides some perspective. It looks at all active shooter events, not just completed mass shootings that are ones reported by the media. The report shows that active shooting incidents are indeed on the rise, but it also documents that armed citizens can make a difference. David French, looking at the FBI report, says, as more Americans obtain carry permits, more Americans will be on scene and able to react. Moreover, what's missing from the data is any indication that armed citizens make the crisis worse. The stereotype of carry permit holders spraying panic gunfire is simply wrong. This report shows what armed citizens can do to make us safer. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, if you're out hiking or backpacking and you lose your compass, you can lose your way. Of course, you could also lose your way if you don't know how to read your compass. And we are wondering whether or not the Boy Scouts of America, now just called Scouts, have lost their way. And so we want to talk about that for a little bit longer with Mark Hancock and also talk about the alternative Trail Life USA. And before we get into some of the other aspects of what's available through Trail Life, speak to this issue because the argument was made, and I mean, there's some validity to it, that girls love adventure too. Girls love to go camping as well as boys, but I don't know that that is a justification for turning the Boy Scouts into the Scouts. That could be another alternative. And I guess, if I can say something really controversial here, Mark, I think boys and girls are different. I know that gets me in a lot of trouble when I say that sometimes, but I think anybody that looks at it from a biblical point of view or just a common sense point of view recognizes that the needs of boys and girls, even in camping, is just different. And the desires of what they want to pursue are different. And so I think keeping them separate makes sense. Your thoughts?
Well, you're exactly right. And, of course, anytime you do say that boys and girls are different, then somebody's going to raise their hand and say, well, my son really enjoys things that girls would typically enjoy, or my daughter really enjoys things. So there's certainly those exceptions. So it's a generalized statement, but I think that if you ask most parents or most engaged and aware teachers, they would tell you that girls and boys are different. In fact, one of the first articles that I read when they decided that Boy Scouts would allow boys and girls and Cub Scouts was a quote of the troop leader that said, in essence, well, it's great having the girls because they're much better behaved and they listen a lot better and they pay attention. I'm
Probably
thinking,
true.
Oh my gosh, you nailed the reason that you shouldn't be putting girls in there, because boys, you got to admit, our schools are pretty much designed for girl-centric environments. Sit still, be quiet, listen to the teacher, which is just difficult for a boy to do. Biologically, by their design, emotionally, every field of psychology, every field of science tells us that boys and girls are different things. They develop at different rates. Girls mature more quickly. Socially, girls are much better, much more mature. And so to think that kind of one size fits all, especially in an adventure environment, is dangerous. Girls mature more quickly physically, and so what I'm concerned about is that boy who's in Boy Scouts, and the boy wants to learn to be more adventurous, wants to be more physical, and wants to learn about the outdoors, and the parents think that's a great environment. But maybe he lacks in those skills, and he hasn't developed yet physically yet to be able to take on some of those challenges. But he's surrounded by these girls who love outdoor adventure, and they're killing it. And they're climbing the ropes faster, and they're running faster. And so what poor Timmy gets is, gosh, Timmy, you need to run faster like the girls do. And all he's gotten all week in school is you need to sit still like the girls do. So I agree with you that, and most engaged parents and teachers would tell you that boys and girls are different. And we think that both girls and boys are better served in an environment that recognizes that they have their unique learning abilities and strengths, and you recognize those strengths. And there's great organizations. This American Heritage Girls is a tremendous organization for girls that offers outdoor adventure, and they're good friends of ours, and we have no intention of ever having girls in our program, because they've got a great alternative.
Yes, they do.
And it would really it would do harm for boys for just the reason that I said, put them in that environment that just isn't made for them. I heard a story about a group of boys and girls who were attending a retreat and sent out into the darkness with a pen and a pad and a candle and a book of matches, and they were told to sit quietly and kind of write deeply about themselves, about who it is they thought they are. Well, the girls went out and did that, and the boys, of course, threw their pads in a pile and lit them on fire and had a great bonfire. It's just going to have boys and girls are just going to respond different in situations.
Let's, if we can, before we run out of time, talk about the biblical foundation for trail life. One of the things people have loved about Boy Scouts is, to be honest, a significant number of these Boy Scout troops have been associated with churches. I see that changing rather dramatically, and I know you do as well, Mark. But even when they were part of the churches, they didn't include some of the things you have in trail life, because you really emphasize this idea of a biblical worldview. Can you explain?
Yeah, this is kind of a secret, but it's not to us, is that we're not an outdoor adventure organization that has kind of having a Christian experience. We are at our core a Christian ministry that uses the outdoors and those types of skills and experience in order to grow godly young men. And that's a dramatic difference of Boy Scouts. Our relationship with our local charter partner, who 99% of the time is going to be a church, our relationship with them is that we consider ourselves an outreach of that local church. We're not just a group that meets in their basement on Tuesday nights. We are a part of that church, much like they would have their youth ministry or their Sunday school. We are an outreach of that church, and churches that are embracing that are using the Trail Life program to bring new families into their church. You can invite a boy all the time to come to Sunday school, and he may not come, but you ask him to go hiking or rappelling or zip lining or caving or something like that, and that boy shows up, and the unchurched family joins the troop, and then the unchurched family joins the church, and we're seeing that happen over and over again.
Mm-hmm. And so, again, just a great opportunity, and some of the badges they earn relate to that as well. True, right?
They do. We have 7 frontiers that our badges fit under, and our values frontier is all Christ-centered. And Christian worldview is throughout the whole program. We call it like a carrot and carrot cake. When you get a piece of carrot cake, you don't get a big chunk of carrot that you're going to choke on. but you get carrot in every bite, and that's how the Christian worldview is integrated in our entire program.
Let's talk about what's available on the website. It's traillifeusa.com. People don't have to remember that because if they just go to pointofview.net, we have a link there. Now, you have a Get Connected section for where people can volunteer and everything, but I think the starting point is to start or find a troop. You might click on Find a Troop, and then you have a map, and then it gives you a chance to see all the places where Trail Life USA already exists. So that would be the first thing for our listeners in the 40-plus states that actually hear this broadcast. But if you find yourself saying, there's really not one in my community, I'm in a small town here, you can click on the button that says Start a Troop, and there is an opportunity as they go through some of the training to actually have a troop in their community. So talk about both ways in which people can participate with you.
Well, we would love it if we had a troop in every community, but we're just over 4 years old, so we don't have that yet. So, but you may be in a community where you have a troop that's already meeting. And so that Find a Troop, you just put in your zip code or the name of your city and tell how far you're willing to drive, and it'll show you the contact information for the nearby troops. And you can reach out to that troop and ask them what night they meet on or how you can be a part of it and get more information on that specific troop. Some of the troops have a website that you can visit for that individual troop. But if you don't have a troop nearby and you have an interest in discipling and mentoring boys, then you can go to our Starter Troop. And there's some videos on there, there's instructions that take you through the process. It takes 4 or 5 adults in a chartering organization to get a troop up and running. About 75% of our troops are started by a layperson, somebody who's a member of a church who's interested in helping boys, may have some interest in the outdoors, but if they don't, we have resources for them, or guarantee you'll find somebody in the community can teach you how to play in the outdoors. But they can go there and 4 or 5 adults in a chartering organization, and you're up and running.
And again, I've seen chartered troops, pre-chartered troops, and point men. And as I took a quick look, it seems like in almost every place where we broadcast, there is something. And, of course, it depends on what particular community you're in and what would be the most convenient. But, again, find out a little bit more information about Trail Life. We have, of course, a link to the website. We have a link to the Facebook page, the Twitter account, as well as one article that was written about Mark and what is happening there at Trail Life. So, as always, appreciate you joining us, and we are glad that even if the Boy Scouts seem to have lost their compass, you've kind of figured out where true north is and you're following biblical principles, and I appreciate the fact that you're doing that and encourage people to find out more about Trail Life.
Thank you, Kerby. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate you and what you're doing.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, a Supreme Court decision involving religious liberty, 7-2 decision. We'll spend a little bit of time talking with Travis Weber about this Masterpiece Bakery decision that will at least exonerate Jack Phillips and actually say that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission did not handle his claim appropriately. So if you'd like to join that conversation, we're going to talk with him, but we'll take some of your comments as well. 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back and talk more about the Supreme Court decision and look ahead to what that might mean in the future for religious liberty. We'll cover all that right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
As I mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court ruled today in a 7-2 decision, actually faulting the Colorado Civil Rights Commission in their handling of the claims of Jack Phillips. Of course, that is with the Masterpiece Bakery case. And it has been interesting to see that in addition to the 5 so-called conservative, and I use that word somewhat advisedly. You also had 2 of the liberals, Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan, joining the decision. Written by Anthony Kennedy, the commission's hostility was inconsistent, he says, with the First Amendment's guarantee that all laws be applied in a manner that is neutral towards religion. But he also really focused in a very narrow sense. This is really kind of a narrow victory because it didn't look broadly. As a matter of fact, here's the case, a sentence that in the case shows that they're looking to other cases, perhaps. They said the outcome of the cases like this and other circumstances must await further elaboration in the courts, all in the context of recognizing that these disputes must be resolved with tolerance, without due disrespect to sincere religious beliefs, and without subjecting gay persons to indignities when they seek goods and services in an open market. So to try to kind of pull this together, we want to spend some time talking with Travis Weber. He's been on the program with us before. He's the director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council, a graduate of the Regent University School of Law with an additional degree from the Georgetown University Law Center, an individual that has been watching these issues. And Travis, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks for having me on.
I would say, and I'll see if you agree, that this was a narrow decision. Kelly Shackelford was on a while back after hearing the oral arguments and saying they may sort of decide not to decide. They'll look at the narrow issue of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, but not the broader issue. That may be illustrated by the fact that in her dissent, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, I see no reason why the comments of 1 or 2 commissioners should be taken to overcome Phillips' refusal to sell a wedding cake to Craig and Mullins. So in some respects, it seems like a lot of it was focused on how the Colorado Civil Rights Commission acted and not necessarily ready to resolve the bigger issue of how religious liberty or First Amendment issues come up against the issue of LGBT issues. What's your take?
No, that's exactly right. In essence, the court here decided not to decide by looking at what went wrong at the lower administrative level in this case, and on that basis, holding that the Free Exercise Clause was violated and ruling for Jack Phillips on that basis. So it is a win, and it's good to see this win. It's good to see the court, in a broad sense, affirm the role of religious belief, and clearly affirm that government actors cannot discriminate against or single out or treat religious expression as lesser than other expression. All of that was affirmed in this ruling today. But as you said, the court has not solved even this case definitively in terms of the free speech and free exercise intersection with a sexual orientation non-discrimination provision in a definitive sense, much less the broader issues that swirl around larger social conflicts between religious liberty claims and same-sex marriage and sexual orientation non-discrimination. So there's certainly more work to be done, but we are celebrating the ruling today.
Yeah, again, in terms of the impact that this would have, I don't think this has any impact at all on Aaron and Melissa Klein. They're bakers up in Oregon, or certainly doesn't have any possible a near-term impact for a florist in Washington, a photographer in New Mexico, innkeepers in New York, and a variety of other cases we've talked about. So that still needs to take place in the future, don't you think?
It does. I wouldn't say it has no impact, because what the court made clear today was that where there is religious animus and hostility to religion, the government was basically rebuked for incorporating that at all into the proceedings here. And on that basis, the lower proceedings here are overturned. And so, if parties, the parties in the other cases are going to be looking at this ruling and citing it in support of any claim that there was hostility to their own religious beliefs, right? So the Kleins may have a case for that when you look at the comments and statements, basically anything showing that the government had it singled out, had it out for their religious beliefs, had their religious beliefs singled out, were focused on them, were targeting them, didn't like them because of their perspective or viewpoint specifically, and the fact that they were religious in nature. Any of that can be cited in favor of Aaron and Melissa Klein and any other party that finds itself in that position. Now, it's not some of these cases it's less apparent that occurred. Some of them it may not have occurred, right? And so it's going to depend on the specific case. And obviously, this is not as impactful as if you had the Supreme Court coming out today and ruling on free speech and free exercise grounds. Clearly, there was a right that applied and in Jack Phillips' favor against the Colorado provision here. So they didn't do that, but the win that Jack Phillips did achieve can be cited by other challengers in other cases.
And we'll see where that goes, because we mentioned Aaron and Melissa Klein, Sweet Cakes in Oregon, Baronelle Stutzman, Arlene's Flowers. But I was struck by the fact that you do have that statement by Justice Kennedy. And, of course, in the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage, you had what was called the golden paragraph, where he said it must be emphasized that religions and those who adhere to religious doctrines must continue to advocate with utmost sincerity conviction that by divine precepts, same-sex marriage should not be condoned. So there's been a couple of times where you do see that Anthony Kennedy, Justice Kennedy, has tried to thread the needle. And even in that comment there, on the one hand, we want to make sure that we don't disrespect sincere religious beliefs. And on the other hand, we don't want to subject gay persons to indignities. So if that's a preview of future decisions, I think this is, like you said, a win and at least a step in the right direction.
It is. It is a step in the right direction. There's a lot in the opinion today that leaves things very open-ended. I mean, the court clearly stated in the opinion today things like you mentioned, Justice Kennedy going back to his Obergefell ruling and noting that religious beliefs have a role to play in the public square. It stated that language and those principles, but it also then went to state non-discrimination principles and noted that non-discrimination law, is a longstanding and legitimate part of our legal frameworks, and so then it sort of doesn't really conclude how they're going to intersect going forward. It just rules for Jack Phillips in this case, pointing to the religious animus that he endured, but it doesn't rule on the larger conflicts that it notes and it recognizes and listed in the opinion today, noting that you have these conflicts. The one thing the court was clear about was saying that clergy are not going to be forced to officiate over same-sex ceremonies if they object, and that's constitutionally clear. And the court kind of lists that and says, well, this is clear, and we all know that's clear, though, right? So the court, what it lists is sort of the easy cases. The court didn't really deal with the hard work, the hard conflict. Now, some of that is oftentimes we don't get a clear, broad ruling from the court until issues percolate up to the court. Until you have enough of them, the court is going to rule on what's before it. So that's understandable in a sense. But the effect of that is that you have especially today, you have a very narrow ruling.
Yes. Again, I thought it was instructive that at least they tried to kind of relate those back. You have the 2014 same-sex marriage case. 2015, you know, the 2014 case, which was, of course, the Hobby Lobby case about whether or not to provide abortifacients to its workers. So it's kind of trying to deal with some of these issues, and this one at least gives some more context, and like you said, in terms of other decisions may be significant. So let me take a break. We'll come back and get into a couple other aspects of this. By the way, if you'd like to join us, we'll open up the phones, give you a chance to weigh in with your comments a little bit later, and if you have some thoughts about this decision coming down today, a 7-2 decision, which is one in which, again, the court, with the 5 justices on the conservative side, 2 of them on the liberal side, which would be Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan. The only 2 that did not join that would be Sonia Sotomayor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But 7-2 decision saying that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission's handling of the claims brought against Jack Phillips showed a hostility towards religion. And I thought it was interesting that Kristen Wagner, who is, again, the particular case was coming from Alliance Defending Freedom, said that Jack Phillips serves all customers. He simply declines to express messages or celebrate events that violate his deeply held beliefs. She went on to say creative professionals who serve all people should be free to create art consistent with their convictions without the threat of government punishment. And so we'll come back and deal with this a little bit longer. But if you'd like to join the conversation today, very important case coming down from the Supreme Court, 7-2. in favor of Jack Phillips, in favor of religious liberty, though a narrow decision, which we will get back to a little bit later, I suspect, with other cases. Let's take a break. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Military chaplains have been leading prayer at military events for as long as this country has had a military. But one group wants the military to silence the prayers of chaplains. In February of 2017, a group sent a letter to commanders of the Air National Guard base in Peace, New Hampshire. The letter, signed by an attorney, had the look and feel of a legal demand letter, but while it tossed around legal lingo and cited a case or two, it stopped short of actually threatening a lawsuit. Nonetheless, their message was pretty clear. Prayer at official events violates the Constitution, is beyond the scope of a government entity, and is unnecessary and divisive, it said. Our friends at the Chaplain Alliance for Religious Liberty, a group of endorsers that speaks for about half of our armed forces chaplains, asked us to respond. Mike Berry, one of our attorneys and former Marine JAG officer, calmly explained that the Constitution, federal law, military regulations, and court precedent make it clear that not only may chaplains pray at official events, chaplains are protected when they do. The Air National Guard says the invocations will now continue. You should visit firstliberty.org and read the rest of First Liberty's letter. Military chaplains play an essential role and should never be censored or prohibited from providing invocations at official military events. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Travis Weber with us for a few more minutes, Director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council. We have a link on the website for you to find some of their information. And Jack Phillips today, who was exonerated in part, said, "It's hard to believe that the government punished me for operating my business consistent with my beliefs about marriage. This isn't freedom or tolerance." Went on to say, "I'm so thankful to the U.S. Supreme Court for this ruling." Travis, let me come back and recognize that if people have a problem with this ruling, they maybe need to take it out of the issue of sexual orientation or LGBT and recognize that for just a minute, let's look at Jack Phillips, who has also in the past declined to design cakes that celebrate divorce, for example. He also declined to design cakes that celebrated Halloween. He's declined to celebrate, on a number of occasions apparently, cakes that would have an adult theme or cakes that would be anti-American. Now, just turn it around and imagine if, for example, an individual comes in and wants to celebrate his or her divorce and he says no, and that person takes this to the Colorado Civil Rights Commission and says, he wouldn't bake a cake for me to celebrate my divorce. And imagine that case even going to the Supreme Court. I have trouble thinking that any of the Supreme Court justices would think that that was a relevant issue, because after all, we allow individuals who are creative, a painter, a writer, a photographer, a florist, a cake decorator, to express their creativity. And if you were to say, no, you have to design a cake for divorce, or you have to bake a cake for same-sex wedding, it seems to me that that's compelled speech. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of issues here. I do think taking it outside of the same-sex marriage context helps people see a bit more of the underlying principle here, right? Because many people would agree with a business owner who wanted to decline to participate in creating Halloween-themed products or something to help someone celebrate Halloween. The same type of public outcry would not ensue. And if many people, sort of look at that and step back and ask why that is, they'd realize what they're objecting to is the substance of the belief, not the principle of religious freedom as it's practiced in our law under the First Amendment and under statute. So when we see that, we have to understand that religious freedom law applies to everyone in all situations, and we don't make judgments about when it should or shouldn't apply based on when we don't like the underlying beliefs. This is precisely what Colorado did in this situation, what the administrative actors here did in singling out Jack's religious beliefs. This is why the Supreme Court noted and observed that that same commission had approved of business owners declining to create cakes they found offensive, cakes that were in opposition to same-sex marriage as requested by other customers, but then ruled against Jack Phillips. So the court looked at that and said, hold on here, what's going on is the state's opposition to Jack's religious beliefs, the substance of them, not the state's correct application of religious freedom law. So definitely that played a big part in what went on here.
Let me also, just before we let you go, talk about some of the resources that are available through Family Research, and in particular, what is available through the Center for Religious Liberty, because I know that you've written recently, for example, on flocking to tend to our nation's spiritual needs. If people go to frc.org and then actually have that drop-down menu and go to Religious Liberty, they're going to find all sorts of great resources. But talk about some of these other issues, because we have, of course, this case that's come down. We have, of course, one out of California, which relates to pregnancy resource centers. But you've also been looking at the broader issue of religious liberty, tax exemption, housing, allowances. There are just a lot of religious liberty cases that are keeping you busy right now, aren't there?
Yeah, there are, and we do try to track and monitor and understand what's going on in the broader context, so we can ensure that people of faith are best protected, and we have the best legal protections and policy protections in place for them. One of the ways we do this is through our Hostility to Religion publication. That's available on our website at frc.org, Hostility to Religion, and religious hostility, and that is in detail, kind of goes through a number of scenarios in different areas similar to Jack Phillips' case, but often different, based on the exact kind of public sphere that they occupy. In addition, we have our overview of religious freedom and how we think about it, frc.org/religious liberty. That's how we think about the principle and how it works in law. You find many more resources at the site, but those are just two of the ones that we've focused on the topic of religious liberty.
Let me mention that again, because it's called Hostility to Religion, the Growing Threat to Religious Liberty in the United States. If you've printed it out, first of all, put a lot of paper in your printer. It's 69 pages long, and it just documents this in such great detail. And so, again, it's frc.org/hostility report, or just follow the links and the prompts to get you there, because that, I think, is important, Travis. We are dealing with a society right now that says, you religious people, you're just complaining. You're just a bunch of whiners. You're a bunch of snowflakes. Nobody's threatening your religious liberty. You're making all of this up. I would encourage you to then print out that 69-page document. It's a PDF document. You can print it out on hostility to religious liberty. Hand it to someone and say, does this look like we're just snowflakes, or are you just unaware of the fact that almost every day Travis Weber and Family Research Council, and of course our friend Kelly Shackelford and First Liberty, have to deal with so many of these cases? So again, it's just another great resource you have there at the Family Research Council. And of course, we always encourage people to take the time to sign up for the Washington Update. You'll find out a lot more from those particular articles that come out every day. It's one of those must-read particular pieces of resources that can come into your inbox, and so we encourage you to get them and read them. And Travis, I appreciate you taking the time out of, I'm sure it's going to be a very busy day, to comment briefly on the Supreme Court decision that is 7-2 in favor of Jack Phillips. So thank you for joining us today on Point of View. Look forward to the next opportunity.
Absolutely, anytime.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we might take some phone calls if you would maybe have some comments about this. Very interesting series of statements, interestingly enough, by Justice Anthony Kennedy. And I might also mention that there are some concurring opinions by actually Justice Gorsuch, as well as by the two liberals on the court that decided that they would agree, but actually at least established that they had some slight disagreements, Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan. And then, of course, you have the dissenting opinion, which comes from Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor. But one more quote, just before we take a break, from Justice Kennedy. He said, "The reason and motive for the baker's refusal were based on his sincere religious beliefs and convictions." They said the court's precedents make clear that the baker, in his capacity as the owner of a business serving the public, might have his right of the free exercise of religion limited by generally applicable laws. Justice Kennedy goes on to say, still, the delicate question of when the free exercise of religion must yield to an otherwise valid exercise of state power needed to be determined in an adjudication in which religious hostility on the part of the state itself would not be a factor in the balance the state sought to reach. In other words, he's sort of looking forward to a time in which we have one where the state was not so hostile so that we can really resolve it. So that's known as kicking the can down the judicial road. And I suspect, I could be wrong, but I suspect that the case that might ultimately resolve that would be Aaron and Melissa Klein, the case out of Oregon, which is the case that Kelly Shackelford and First Liberty have. So we'll see how that plays out. And so that is at least a little bit of a look at the decision that came down today from the Supreme Court. We'll be watching some of the other cases, but we need to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about how the new Christian left is twisting the gospel and damaging the faith.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. First hour, we spent some time talking about religious liberty, in large part because the Supreme Court ruled today in a 7-2 decision that actually faulted the Colorado Civil Rights Commission's handling of the claims brought by Jack Phillips of Masterpiece Bakery. And so we've spent some time talking about that. And as we get into the topic this hour, I thought it was interesting that Todd Starnes says at a time when religious liberty is increasingly coming under attack, the church needs prophetic voices like Chelsen Vicari, and she is with us, an individual that has graduated from, first of all, Radford University with a bachelor's degree in political science and history and a master's degree in international politics from Regent University's Robertson School of Government. No, back when I used to teach there, it was CBN University. Now it's Robertson University, and she is with the Institute for Religion Democracy, somebody I connected up with years ago when I was at Georgetown, and she's actually in the Institute for Religion Democracy Evangelical Program and the director of that. In the past, she has also worked with Concerned Women for America and authors of this book that has been out for a while called Distortion: How the New Christian Left is Twisting the Gospel and Damaging the Faith. And we have information about her, about IRD, and about this book, all available at the website pointofview.net. About 200 pages. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it easy for you to order it there. And Chelsen, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me, Kerby.
We also might encourage people to watch some of the videos that are out there of various presentations that you have given. And one of the videos I've watched of you spends some time talking about your own personal pilgrimage. In some respects, this book isn't just a place where you sort of researched it from a distance. You experienced some of this as well, and came to the conclusion for a while that your parents just really were kind of all fuddy-duddies that hadn't really thought through how to apply Christianity into the 21st century. Can you share a little bit of your own testimony?
Absolutely. Well, the point of the book, first, is just to give readers a glimpse into the world of a typical evangelical millennial who's spiritually and emotionally being targeted on Christian campuses and youth groups or wherever their young Christian ministries might lead them. And I absolutely use my own personal story as sort of the case study to build my foundation. I came to know Christ at age 8 when my parents, because they stumbled into a local church, because they were dealing with serious marriage struggles. They came to Christ, and then therefore I was introduced to Jesus. And so raised in a very conservative, a wonderfully conservative or faithful Christian denomination, the Assemblies of God, and was even homeschooled in high school, and very passionate about my faith until I got to college. And it was at college that I joined a Christian campus ministry. Sounds harmless enough. My parents thought it was a wonderful idea, but this particular campus ministry was what they referred to as interdenominational. And so it was the first time I came into contact with folks who might belong to the Episcopal Church or the Presbyterian Church USA, rather liberal denominations. And so for the first time, I'm encountering theology that doesn't fit what I had been taught all my life, a theology that accepts same-sex marriage as something that can be ordained by God, or accepts abortion as something that can be reconciled with our faith. remember, Kerby, one time coming back from family vacation, and same-sex marriage came up in the car. And I was in the car with my parents, and I remember yelling with them because my parents were trying to explain to me why you can't reconcile same-sex marriage, why you can love your same-sex neighbors, or your neighbors, who are attracted to the same sex, but why you can't reconcile same-sex behavior and relationships with traditional Christian teachings. And I was so upset by this and frustrated with them and screaming at one point. And my parents, I have to say, were very calm and trying to explain and give the social science and the scriptures behind why it is that for 2,000 years marriage has been established between a man and woman. And my parents started to realize, where has this all come from? Why all of a sudden is she trying to uphold an unorthodox Christian view of Scripture? And they realized that it was coming from my own campus Christian ministry, and somewhere they didn't expect to find it.
No, if anything, you would expect that that'd be a safe place, where you learn about evangelism, you learn about Christian discipleship and the rest. And one of the things you say early on in your book, while we're talking about Christians, is you say there are kind of three types of evangelical Christians: couch potato Christians, cafeteria-style Christians, and convictional Christians. And I love what you say. I know about these three types because at one time or another I have fallen into each one of these three categories. So this is an important part to recognize that there are a lot of pressures, not just outside the church, but sometimes inside the church, trying to force you into the latest kind of cultural orthodoxy. True?
Right. So at this particular campus ministry and then in other areas, I found Christian leaders and my peers encouraging that coexist, tolerate, keep out of it narrative that we hear when we're engaging in, when often Christians are engaging in public policy or the public square. But I was seeing this in my campus ministry. So, yes, I at one time or another was either a couch potato Christian, and I sort of defined couch potato Christianity as those who might adapt to culture by just simply staying silent on the hot-button issues or the tough cultural issues affecting the church. So couch potato Christians will maybe secretly believe in faithful traditional Christian teaching, but they're not going to promote it, and they're certainly not going to evangelize. They're just going to downplay absolute truths and stay sitting on the couch, basically. And so I found myself doing this when I first got to college, because when I was hearing for the first time these very unorthodox messages, I just kept everything to myself. I wasn't quite affirming. That came later by my senior year, but I certainly was staying silent. And then the cafeteria-style Christian, I think I moved over into, and that's the kind that sort of treats Christianity and the Scriptures as a buffet line, where we can go down the buffet line picking and choosing what applies to our life and what doesn't. And then finally, convictional Christianity, which I think every day I'm striving to achieve. It's where we are following Christ's teaching to not only love God, but to love others, and also to share the gospel uncompromised with the rest of the world.
So again, let me just mention that we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into this book in a little more detail, titled Distortion. And I have a couple of suggestions. One of the reasons why I'm kind of glad we're covering this right now is you're about ready, perhaps parent or grandparent, to send some of these high school graduates off to college. And I think you probably need to get a copy of this book. First of all, for you, but maybe get two, one for you and one for your child or grandchild, to recognize what they may be encountering. There is a tendency sometimes to say, well, if I'm sending them off to the state university, okay, I know they're going to be getting hostile and unbiblical ideas, but if they're in a Christian group, that's not such a problem. Matter of fact, that'd probably reinforce their faith. Not necessarily. And this book, I think, is one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this today before you send some of these bright, enterprising minds off to the university. And so we have a way in which you can get it in paperback or Kindle on our website. If you can find it in a local bookstore, all the better. It's entitled Distortion, How the New Christian Left is Twisting the Gospel and Damaging the Faith. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The debate about shooting incidents in America can be divided into at least two categories. What can be done to prevent a shooting? What can we do to stop a shooting that is taking place? Gun control advocates focus most of their attention on the first issue, but Glenn Kessler, doing a fact check in the Washington Post, explained that most gun restrictions wouldn't prevent mass shootings. A recent example was the shooter in Santa Fe, Texas, who had a shotgun and a revolver, but no gun that would be restricted under the current proposed legislation. Is there anything we can do to stop a shooter once he decides to use a weapon? The FBI report on active shooter incidents in the United States provides some possible answers. Looking at the data, it is easy to conclude that the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is to have a good guy with a gun. The good guy could either be law enforcement or an armed citizen. But there are many people who reject the idea that the way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. They say it is a nice-sounding slogan, but it is rarely true. That is where the FBI report provides some perspective. It looks at all active shooter events, not just completed mass shootings that are ones reported by the media. The report shows that active shooting incidents are indeed on the rise, but it also documents that armed citizens can make a difference. David French, looking at the FBI report, says, as more Americans obtain carry permits, more Americans will be on scene and able to react. Moreover, what's missing from the data is any indication that armed citizens make the crisis worse. The stereotype of carry permit holders spraying panic gunfire is simply wrong. This report shows what armed citizens can do to make us safer. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Chelsen Vicari, and she is the author of the book Distortion, How the New Christian Left is Twisting the Gospel and Damaging the Faith. And Chelsen, before we get into some of the particular issues and people, I thought for a minute I would want to broaden this, because I talked as we went to the break about certainly parents and grandparents sending young people off to college need to pay attention to what happened to you. But this happens at a lot earlier age, and you tell a story which makes me smile, because you're actually teaching a Sunday school class, and you and your partner decided, well, I know, we'll just try to maybe do some true-false. So question number 1, Jesus is God, true. All right, great job. Question number 2 is Jesus sinned, false. Bingo, again. So getting Jesus is God, Jesus sinned. Question number 3, Jesus is one of many ways to heaven, true. And you go, what? I mean, right in the midst of that, you say, wait a minute, we've been teaching Sunday school. We've been taking the curriculum that you wanted us to teach, and yet we have young people here already at this age, already believing that people can be saved apart from Jesus Christ. And I think it illustrates that when we look at these issues, these are not problems that surface in high school or college. Sometimes going all the way back to grade school and middle school, we are dealing with some really important issues, and this is why we have to pay attention to what these young people are learning right now.
Right. For 3 years, I taught that particular class of young people, and they were middle schoolers, my favorite age group, and I was really shocked because that was my last year teaching, actually, that we did that little questionnaire. And sort of broke my heart that that was the response, because you would have never guessed it. This was a Baptist church. These kids were raised in the the lacking discipleship that these kids had, even though they were raised in the church. But a lot of these particular kids, their parents sort of use Sunday school as the end-all, be-all. So just like basketball or ballet, they were dropping these kids off for an hour with us and then expecting them to learn everything they needed to counter the world that they were. This was a church outside of the Washington, D.C. area, so their school's very liberal. And you could see that liberal worldview was certainly impacting their outlook on Scripture, no matter what we had taught them. So, yes, it pointed to a bigger problem. And a lot of the kids in that class, what we discovered was that they were so worried that they were going to offend their friends that they were willing to either suffocate their own beliefs or just change their beliefs altogether because they wanted to be loving. And so they had a hard time understanding why in one sense we were saying you have to love your neighbor, but in another sense we were saying, but you have to uphold marriages between one man and one woman. They did not want to hurt their friends with same-sex attraction feelings. And so that is a bigger symptom, or that is a symptom of the bigger problem. And it's not just middle schoolers, and it's not just millennials either, Kerby. I mean, we see this across the board with age groups of Christians sort of being susceptible to this feel-good doctrine and the gospel of nice, and how it's really contributing to just a lack of defense of the uncompromised gospel within a lot of local churches.
Well, again, one of the other articles we've posted here for people to read today, why there's an increased interest in homeschooling. Of course, that has to do with the school shootings and a variety of other issues, but it has to do with the kind of the mismatch that you face, Chelsen, because what you're trying to do in an hour or 2 hours on a Sunday is counteract, let's see, at least 50 hours of media input that a typical millennial will probably have in terms of television, in terms of computers, in terms of smartphones, in terms of video games, and then a good section of the same almost 50 hours, maybe about more closer to about 40 hours of public school education, not to mention all the peer interaction and all the rest. And you're supposed to counteract that with a 1 hour Sunday school class. Guess who wins? And so it just illustrates again some of what we are up against. But I want to focus some time on some very disturbing chapters in your book, I think, for our listeners. One of those is the emergent movement, because as we have already talked about on this program before, but I think your book really illustrates more than we might have realized, it isn't just the pressures from the secular culture, the media, education, even politics, but even inside the churches sometimes and inside the Christian organizations that some of your young people might join, they are accepting some false ideas. And I would imagine for some of our listeners, they may never even have heard the term the emergent movement. Can you educate us?
Sure. So the emergent church movement started in the late 1990s, early 2000s. It grew very quickly, very popular, very liberal in its approach to Scripture. God's supremacy was really diminished by this movement. This movement pointed out inconsistencies in Scripture, and so it led to a lot of confusion among young people interested in it, and truth was made relative overall. What has happened is that movement sort of disintegrated. It didn't make it. It did not thrive, and that's not surprising to us. But what is interesting and what's important to note is that the leaders within the emergent church movement didn't really go anywhere. Instead, they just sort of took back their evangelical terminology and labels and then just became part of the fabric of our local conservative or traditional churches. And so they became Sunday school teachers. They became youth group ministers. And that was sort of what I encountered in college. It was individuals who had been very influenced by the emergent church. And while they didn't use the label emergent anymore, and they might have used the label evangelical, they certainly didn't hold to an evangelical Orthodox Christian teaching.
Well, and again, some of them sold best-selling books. Some of them produced very successful video series. Some of them were very successful bloggers and speakers, and still are, by the way, so I'm not just saying in the past tense. And so, in a sense, when people say, well, he or she's an evangelical, well, yes, in the broadest sense of the word, But in terms of embracing ideas that would be contrary to Scripture, that's really the problem. And somebody that goes out on the internet and says, oh, there's a blog by an evangelical, I'll read what he or she has to say, and starts imbibing some of these false doctrinal ideas, that's where the problem begins, don't you think?
Exactly. A lot of these bloggers are very good writers, I have to say. They're very savvy in their social media skills. And a lot of young Christians just aren't equipped to counter a lot of the arguments being made by these liberal Christians, or the religious left, if you will. I know I wasn't, because if you had asked me when I was in college, I need you to define an evangelical, I wouldn't have been able to. So that's a problem in itself. And for those listening, I wouldn't have been able to tell you that an evangelical is someone who has a personal relationship with Jesus, sees Scripture as authoritative, and sees an urgency in sharing the gospel. I wouldn't have been able to tell you what the gospel, if somebody says, can you define gospel? I wouldn't have been able to define gospel, Kerby, which is simply what Christ has done and what he continues to do for us. So because there was a big, and remember I was raised in church.
Yes.
So because there was a big lacking on discipleship in my life. And by the way, I like to say that I finally put down my Rob Bell book and picked up my Bible, and that's sort of when the blinders started to come off, because Rob Bell was one of those, not any longer, I'm not even sure, I think he refers to himself as Christian-ish, but he was, when I was in college, one of those very popular voices that he might not have said he was emergent, but he certainly could have fit the descriptors. But yes, so the climate has changed. We're not seeing the emergent church in its former glory, but we do see the remnants of it, and those remnants have been very effective.
Let me just mention, as we're going to a break, that you can find out more about this book, Distortion. But I thought Chelsen would also point people to the IRD, and it is theird.org. You don't have to remember all of that. And as a matter of fact, you've got a piece there about the Supreme Court decision today. But I followed the Institute for Religion and Democracy back in the days when Diane Nippers ran it, and when Richard John Newhouse, who I interacted with when I was at Georgetown and with the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Of course, Mark Tooley has it now, and it's an outstanding organization. So if you'd like to know more about the Institute on Religion and Democracy, it's theird.org. You can find some articles, for example, by Chelsen and Mark and others on the website today. And if you'd like to know more about the book, I, again, think you could probably find it in your local bookstore. But if not, we've made it possible for you to go to their website, or we also have a link so that you can get it on paperback or Kindle. And I hope by now we've maybe given you some reasons to think about why you want to read this book or pass it on to a young person heading off to college so he or she does not maybe imbibe some of these false ideas. We've kind of covered part one. We're going to get into part two, digging into the issues. What about the same-sex dilemma, the social justice facade, feminism? We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Imagine you work where you know people do not share your faith, and they certainly don't agree with a Christian view of life and culture. You are surrounded by hostility every single day. How important would it be to have solid information to back you up? Jim in South Carolina listens to Point of View in the afternoons. He writes, I teach in a public secular university and enjoy actually being a voice for the biblical Christian worldview in a liberal setting. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for being bold and proclaiming truth. And Jim finishes, I pray for you daily. Jim works in hostile territory, and he prays for Point of View because Point of View is a source of truth. Please help us continue being here for Jim and everyone else. We need you to visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151 and join the Truth Team. Enable us to be here each day by giving each month. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You may just want to sit back and listen to Chelsen Vicari, but if you would like to join us or maybe have a comment or question or testimony, certainly we are concerned about the various ways in which young people are actually taken away from biblical ideas. We're very concerned, as you know, about millennials. That's why every Wednesday we do the Millennial Roundtable. I have a chance to join Nick Pitts, and I'll actually host it when he's not sitting in the host chair. And so, again, we're talking about this very significant issue, what is pulling many of our young people away from Orthodox faith. And I think you will really appreciate the book Distortion. It's been out for a couple of years here, but we really wanted to focus on this as you think about young people heading off to college. Let's, if we can, Chelsen, get into the issue of same-sex dilemma, that you call it, confronting the same-sex dilemma, because as your parents tried to communicate to you, even while you might have been shouting at the time, we want to certainly love individuals that have same-sex attraction, but there is a danger when we start trying to redefine what marriage is, and that is something that has really taken the millennial generation by storm, hasn't it?
It has. The same-sex dilemma is one of the toughest issues that young Christians are having to face, because all of us have friends or even family members, sisters or brothers, who say that they are same-sex attracted, and we want desperately to love them, but also we have convictions, and for some of us it can be very difficult to maintain our convictions and also support and love our same-sex attracted neighbors. Not because we aren't trying, but because there's often a line, and sometimes our same-sex attracted neighbors will say, you can't, if you love me, then you need to support me, you should come to my wedding, or whatever it is. And like we saw at the Supreme Court today, that sometimes being loving is having to say, I can't do this because of my love and commitment to Christ. I can't participate in your wedding. I have to politely decline. And that is a very difficult thing to do for all of us, no matter our age, but especially when you're young, especially when all you want to do is make friends at a new college that you're at, or what have you. And yes, this is terribly difficult, but especially because a lot of young people don't quite understand the significance of God's establishment of marriage. They don't quite understand that Jesus affirmed the Old Testament or God's creation of marriage in Matthew. They don't have a good grounding on how to counter the arguments, because the arguments are, again, steeped in a very compassionate-sounding language, and you're, on the other side, defending marriage as between one man and one woman, and you're, of course, made to seem intolerant or bigoted. And for so many young people, it's just a lot easier to throw up our hands and say, okay, fine, you win. I'm just going to cross the line and support same-sex marriage, because it seems like the loving thing to do. And you're right, Jesus said to love everyone, so it must mean I support same-sex marriage.
Well, again, one of the things I always say is that we have to have both intention, our biblical convictions, and our biblical compassion. And the stereotype, which I think is valid, is that oftentimes in the past, fundamentalism has really been big on the biblical convictions, but very low on biblical compassion. But on the other hand, you've had the liberal churches, and certainly you've talked about that at the Institute for Religion and Democracy, that have been big on the biblical compassion but low on the biblical convictions. And I think we have to hold both of those simultaneously. We should have both truth and love. So very important point, and it's a great chapter, but I want to move on to a couple of others, because you have one called Unmasking the Social Justice Facade. And that's a concern, because there are a lot of people talking about social justice today. You even got a kind of an interesting story about Tony Campolo, who, it's been almost 30 years since I sat into one of his classes, but I've known him for some time. And he was saying in this one particular comment that he could understand why North Korea would not release an American missionary, because, after all, missionaries in the United States have been too close to the CIA. And I go, what? And your President Mark Tooley kind of challenged some of those ideas, but that's the issue, is that sometimes the comments that come from individuals who are evangelical Christian, or maybe they don't even call themselves evangelicals anymore, are hurtful because the social justice crusaders that are inside the church don't look a whole lot different than the so-called social justice crusaders outside the church.
Right. And I will say that Tony Campolo is actually one of the more moderate voices, if you can believe that, that we have encountered. So, right, social justice has just really become synonymous with liberal political platforms like same-sex marriage, or even redistributing wealth, or dismantling America's armed forces. I'll give you one example. I actually went to, Tony Campolo is a part of the Red Letter Christians organization.
Right.
And recently they hosted the Lynchburg Revival in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is where Liberty University is, and it was seemingly in protest to Jerry Falwell Jr. So I went and reported for IRD, and I sat there, and the major theme was social justice, but I listened to so much anti-military propaganda. I sat and listened to one particular speaker say, quote, "I am not grateful for your service," unquote, to the military men and women that were in that congregation. And my friend sitting next to me was one. He served in the Marines, and he had to hear, he was with CBN, and he had to hear this. This was a Christian conference whose theme was social justice, and yet we're hearing things antithetical to everything that I had been taught. You don't have to agree on everything when it comes to foreign policy. There's certainly room for debate, but to act as if the United States is an evil imperialist empire was deceitful in and of itself. So social justice is really being misconstrued for whatever the political issue that the individual wants to promote. So abortion, for example, I've seen liberal clergy use abortion and call it reproductive justice, call it a social justice issue, say that abortion is just between God and the woman and her medical professionals.
Wow.
There's so many things behind the curtain at IRD that we see that sometimes people don't even believe, but it is there, and it can be challenging to unmask, especially because I believe in social justice, Kirby. I believe that
sure.
Christians...
All of us do, yeah, but it should look a little bit more Christian in its orientation, don't you think?
I think social justice, one of the major issues should be fighting for the unborn, or fighting for Christians who are being persecuted abroad, overseas, because they stand for Christ. Absolutely. I do think it needs to be a bit different.
I want to get at least one more in before we take a break, and that is unveiling the Jesus feminist. Now, there's a point in the book where you said, you really just kind of became a full-fledged, you said, I morphed into a full-fledged feminist. So how do you go from Assembly of God to a full-blown feminist? And more importantly, we have kind of the evangelical feminist ideas today, and saying that Jesus was a feminist, and explain what a Jesus feminist really looks like in the first place.
Well, they say that feminism, or being a Jesus feminist, is just simply means that women are people too. Well, I certainly believe that. I'm a woman. I have a daughter. I teach her that as well. But it looks like to be in positions of power, or taking her and liberating her from the household, for example. And I believe that liberation only comes through Christ, but it looks a lot closer to the mainstream radical feminist agenda than I think it does to the church.
So again, just a couple of issues that are front and center in the feminist section. And you did mention one. I'll just mention this before we go to the break real quickly. Defending every life, the issue of abortion. It's interesting that right now millennials will say, well, I'm really standing up for issues, sexual trafficking. Well, yeah, but who's against that? But when it comes down to the hard issues, abortion, same-sex marriage, homosexuality, pornography, some of that, well, they're kind of AWOL on that. So you find that sometimes you will have people that say, I'm really standing for social justice, but on the bigger issues, the ones that we talk about around the round table so often, like abortion, those don't necessarily get a mention, do they?
Exactly. No, they don't come up. It's one of those hot-button issues that they will lose friends if they talk about it, so they tend to stay quiet on that issue.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, there are some other sections in there as well about Christian persecution supporting Israel. So I'll talk about that briefly, but we also want to get to part 3, preventing the collapse, speaking truth in love, living out bold faith. So we have a lot more to cover. We'll do it as quickly as we can before the top of the hour. Chelsen Vicari with us, and again, we talk about this book, Distortion. It's published by Frontline. You can look for it in your local bookstore, but I suspect that you will probably want to order it online. We've made that possible for you, and also have a link to the Institute for Religion and Democracy. If you'd like to know what's going on inside the church and how they followed some of these denominational issues, I think you'll find that website helpful as well. Let's take a break, and when we come back, if you'd like to join us, you can give us a call, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back, listen, take some notes, but most importantly, get a copy of the book and be forewarned and be forearmed. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Military chaplains have been leading prayer at military events for as long as this country has had a military. But one group wants the military to silence the prayers of chaplains. In February of 2017, a group sent a letter to commanders of the Air National Guard base in Peace, New Hampshire. The letter, signed by an attorney, had the look and feel of a legal demand letter, but while it tossed around legal lingo and cited a case or two, it stopped short of actually threatening a lawsuit. Nonetheless, their message was pretty clear. Prayer at official events violates the Constitution, is beyond the scope of a government entity, and is unnecessary and divisive, it said. Our friends at the Chaplain Alliance for Religious Liberty, a group of endorsers that speaks for about half of our armed forces chaplains, asked us to respond. Mike Berry, one of our attorneys and former Marine JAG officer, calmly explained that the Constitution, federal law, military regulations, and court precedent make it clear that not only may chaplains pray at official events, chaplains are protected when they do. The Air National Guard says the invocations will now continue. You should visit firstliberty.org and read the rest of First Liberty's letter. Military chaplains play an essential role and should never be censored or prohibited from providing invocations at official military events. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking with Chelsen Vicari for just a few more minutes about her book, Distortion, How the New Christian Left is Twisting the Gospel and Damaging the Faith. I thought we might focus on one of the chapters about supporting Israel, because you have seen, Chelsen, some of these Christian groups say, we want to have disinvestment of Israel, boycotts, all sorts of different issues. This, of course, surfaces from time to time when we have like the 60th anniversary of Israel, or the movement of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and those kinds of things. And it does seem to me that at least some people in the Christian world have become kind of more pro-Palestinian, And I certainly recognize how we should treat everyone with human values and human rights. But at the same time, I also recognize that Israel finds itself surrounded by enemies. This is a country about the size of New Jersey that has had to spend all of its life trying to defend itself and protect itself from those who would want to drive every Jew into the sea. How do we think about this issue, and what caused you to put a chapter about Israel in this book?
Well, I realized that there are a lot of these liberal evangelical elites are painting the Israel-Palestinian conflict as sort of a David and Goliath picture, with Israel, of course, being Goliath and Palestinians being David, and there being this tension between the two, and it's unfair, and it is also painted as a social justice issue, and they're all intertwined. But what's interesting is they have a conference every year, and actually last week, the Christ at the Checkpoint conference, very controversial, is held in Bethlehem at Bethlehem Bible College. And it is one of those conferences that paint Israel as the perpetrator, and I'm not defending Israel as being blame-free, but I also recognize that the Jews are God's people, and that God's gracious providence is still guiding within Israel. And this conference promotes what's called replacement theology, where they believe that actually Christ is now the new covenant, and there's no covenant any longer between God and Israel, and therefore the Jews do not have any claims to the land of Israel. Very disturbing stuff that goes on. It was interesting that this year that particular conference did invite one pro-Israel guest, Dr. Michael Brown, who you probably know, Kerby.
Oh, sure.
And he pointed out the hypocrisy behind these conference organizers who were not calling out the Palestinian Authority for their terrorist activities, and yet they call themselves Christians. So he said, if we want to be loving and we want to put Christ at the center of everything, then we have to say that the Palestinian Authority is not promoting women's rights, is not promoting religious freedom, and is actually promoting terrorism. So I very much appreciated that. So something to be aware of when you're sending your kids off to these conferences promoting justice.
Well said. You know, in your chapter on Speaking Truth and Love, you quote from two people that I love to quote from, Ravi Zacharias, and then Ravi Zacharias quotes from G.K. Chesterton. And Ravi Zacharias said, our culture is flirting with all kinds of things. People are struggling with the lines that are being blurred and erased. And you can be sure what G.K. Chesterton said is right. Whenever you remove any fence, always pause long enough to ask why it was put there in the first place. Especially when we were having the debate years ago about same-sex marriage and even some of the questions about immigration and many other topics, I oftentimes quote from that G.K. Chesterton phrase, you know, before you take down a fence, you might want to ask why it was put there in the first place. And at a time when our culture is tearing down boundaries and fences and hedges and all sorts of things that were erected in large part because people with Christian convictions said, you know, sex inside of marriage is a good idea. Marriage fidelity is a good idea. Not redefining marriage is a good idea. Being a person of your word is a good idea. Those are things that were actually established, and we find ourselves today, and your millennial generation certainly finds yourself today, in a time where fences are being torn down, and it's not just happening outside the church, it's also happening inside the church. So that's why we need to really understand that you are calling for us to be faithful Christians and learn how to speak the truth in love.
Yeah, a lot of younger Christians don't realize this tearing down of these fences. They're not new ideas. We want to think that there are ideas. We want to think we're onto something novel, and we're actually following Jesus in a way that nobody else has followed him before. But actually, the mainline denominations have been doing this for years, and it actually hasn't bode well for their Christian witness. My colleague Jeff Walton today just put out a report looking at the Presbyterian Church USA, who has called for more inclusivity and certainly moving leftward continuously, and they lost 67,000 members. Wow. I want to say that again. They lost over 67,000 members in 2017 alone. And in D.C., the churches that are thriving are not those big, beautiful sanctuaries that have rainbow flags flying outside of them. It's actually the church plant by the Southern Baptist or the Assemblies of God that meet in schoolhouses. Those are the churches that are growing, and they're renting those sanctuaries from those liberal denominations that have maybe 30 people on a Sunday morning. So I think that's something that young Christians need to stop and recognize. We're not onto something new. In fact, it's been tried, it's been done, and it's not working.
Yes, we've had this social experiment going on for decades, long before some of the millennials showed up, and we kind of know where it necessarily leads. Well, let me first of all encourage people to get a copy of the book. It's about 200 pages, and I might just mention you have 25 pages alone of endnotes. So if somebody says, well, I need to read that for myself, or where did you get that fact or figure or statistic, you've done a very good job of pulling that together. So the book is something that I would certainly recommend to all of our listeners. But let's also, for just a minute, talk about what's available on your website. You just mentioned it again, and it is theird.org, which stands for the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And as a result, Jeffrey Walton's piece, I don't despair as members vanish, which is, again, last person out of some of these Presbyterian churches, some of these Anglican churches, some of these Episcopal churches, even some of these Methodist churches turn off the lights because the exodus is dramatic, and that's documented in his piece. Of course, you have your pieces and articles there and all sorts of ways in which people can find out a little bit more about issues like religious liberty, religious freedom, and what's going on in the various denominations. But talk about some of the resources that you're featuring right now at IRD.
Yes, well, we have a piece on the Christ at the Checkpoint conference that I mentioned, featuring Dr. Michael Brown. So I encourage individuals to read that. I very much encourage your listeners to go over and read Jeffrey Walton's piece on the Peace USA. He gives detailed financial breakdowns as well as membership breakdowns over the past decade, I believe. And then, of course, Mark Tooley is always up to something, and he's writing on foreign policy from a Christian worldview lately. So I certainly encourage your listeners to check out our blog, and we have new content every single morning.
And again, just a great resource that is there. And again, I would encourage you to find out a little bit more about Mark Tooley. I know that Janice Shaw Krause is one of the chair people as well. And, of course, going all the way back to the days when it was first begun, Richard John Newhouse, Carl Henry, who I had a chance to be in his home when he was living in the area. Of course, Diane Nippers was your president. George Weigel still around, and just a number of other individuals that have served with you. And again, it's just a great organization, and I appreciate you giving us an hour today, Chelsen, and we look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kerby.
Going to take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, going to get back into some really important issues that I think you will be interested in. And you never know, the Supreme Court might drop another Supreme Court decision on, and that changed some of the direction we were going to go today, but that's just the way it happens. We know that there are some other very important cases the court is going to leave with us by the end of this month, so we'll be paying attention to that every single day. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all